So, Molten mode has been reworked kinda in this update. There's been a couple of changes to it. In fact, with the enemies, there have been a lot of changes to some of the later enemies. Not necessarily the abnormals here, but some say like the Molten Hound. Some of these enemies don't have different stats in sandbox mode than they do in regular Molten mode. Its health has been buffed from 600 to 700, and its defense has increased from 0% to 25%. Now, bearing in mind that this is the base health that I'm stating here, its health scaling is as suggested here. I mean, I forgot what the health scaling is in Molten mode. It's like, I want to say about 5% of the extra health, plus another 5 or 10 health for extra measure, but yes. Meanwhile, for the Molten mech, its speed has increased from 5.5 to 7, its health has increased 1,500 to 1,750, and now it has 25% defense. Its no stun has always been here. Meanwhile, for the Boomer, which is a change I think also happens in Fallen mode, its range debuff when it explodes is decreased from 50% to now 15%, so it's less effective on towers. Meanwhile, the Bullock, the beast that it is, its health has increased from 4,000 to 4,500. As for the Molten Titan, its health has increased from 3,000 to 4,000. Meanwhile, for the Tanker, its health has increased from 9,000 to 10,000. Its fire rate debuff has increased from 30% to 70%. And its range debuff has been nerfed from 50% to 20%. So it kind of balances all out in the end, I guess. So enemies fire a lot slower, but their range is still quite similar to before. That's when it explodes on death. This is bearing in mind that the medic cannot remove the debuff stuns that the Boomer and the Tanker can attribute to enemies. Towers, sorry. Meanwhile, as for the Molten Summoner, its health has increased from 12,000 to 15,000. Its speed has decreased from 2.5 to 2.25. The number of enemies summoned has increased from 4 to 8 to 5 to 10. And as for the Molten Warlord, its health has increased from 120,000 to 150,000. So those are all the changes to the enemies. And as you can see, they're mostly buffs. Now, all the changes mentioned here, as mentioned before, they're the base health. They're not the health scaling. So the Molten Warlord, it would have 180,000 health if there are 4 people in the server. I don't know about 6 people in the server. I don't know if health scaling does that. I'd have to check with Molten. Health scaling increases after quad sizes. Meanwhile, as for specific changes to games, the first 5 quicks in Wave 5 are now corpse, so if you kill them, they become corpse enemies. The corpse enemies aren't that difficult to deal with, but they do appear a lot sooner than before. Additionally, I don't think it was this update, but they did change the Wave 8 commander line from an abnormal boss to an elite abnormal. Also, with the new corpse at Wave 5, which is much sooner than originally some of the other enemies, so for example the Molten, I believe, spawn with corpses, and the first corpses do appear to be Wave 15. It does say here, it suggests that those Moltens are getting more advanced. Don't get too comfortable. Probably should move some of like the corpse abilities to, let's say, Wave 5, where it says like, oh, the first corpse enemies appears, be careful that they can regenerate. I don't know, revive. They call it revive. I say get stuck. They turn into rock and then you have to kill them. Probably should tell new players, you know, on Wave 5, the corpse ability. Meanwhile, on Wave 9, the amount of heavies has increased from 4 to 5, and there are now 4 bloated quicks at the end of these waves. Meanwhile, as for 16, the amount of hiddens has been reduced from 7 to 4. Meanwhile, on Wave 17, the amount of hazmats has increased from 2 to 5 on both hordes, so there's going to be another horde of hazmats. And the amount of breakers has increased from 4 to 6 on both hordes. So there are 5 hazmats here, there are 6 breakers here, there's going to be another 5 hazmats here, and then there's going to be another 6 breakers here. So there's been an increase of 6 hazmats overall and an increase of 4 breakers overall. Breaker 2s that are. As for Wave 18, there are 3 nimble and corpse hiddens at the start of this wave. Meanwhile, as for Wave 20, there's been a decrease of 6 to 4 Moltens here. Meanwhile, on Wave 21, the amount of Molten enemies has increased from 3 to 5, but they are no longer bloated. Because bloated increases the health of enemies by double, this is technically a nerf. It's a slight nerf. It's like removing half a bloated enemy. And they've done it for each horde that appears. So there's one horde here, there's one horde here, And that's it. I guess there's been a decrease of 1 Molten enemy overall, I guess. Meanwhile, as for Wave 23, there's now a hidden boss at the start, and the amount of Molten enemies has increased from 7 to 10. Meanwhile, the Wave 24, there's been an order change, not really necessarily a change to the amount of enemies. So here, instead of it being the mech, then the Elite Molten, then the Elite Hazmat, it's now the mech, the Elite Hazmat, and the Elite Molten. As for Wave 25, there's now 1 Molten mech here, and the Moltens now spawn after the Elite Hounds. Sorry, the Elite Hazmats here. Meanwhile, on Wave 27, the amount of Molten mechs has reduced from 3 to 2, but they are now bloated, so it is a buff slightly of like half a Molten mech. And there are now 5 Elite Hazmats at the end, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in addition to the other Elite Hazmats seen here. On Wave 28, there are now 4 bloated Elite Hazmats, and 1 Molten mech is now bloated. On Wave 29, there's now 1 Molten Titan that appears at the start. On Wave 31, the Molten Golem that appeared at the start has now been replaced with a Bullock. And at the end of Wave 32, there's now a Molten Summoner, which I would like to point out that I think that's everything. And actually, the developers have been quite accurate in their assessment of all the changes to Molten mode. As seen here, all of these are actually accurate, which is a first for the developers. Normally, they've missed out something or things have shadow changed without us knowing. They've done these changes because I'm aware that they can still track games, and they know that some waves are harder than others, and they've adjusted those waves concurrently. And they've noticed that the later waves, are easier than those early ones, and they've accordingly made those harder for players. So who knows if Molten mode will get another change to make it slightly harder or slightly easier. I think personally it's gotten somewhat harder, and I did say it earlier on in the previous video that I thought Molten mode was too easy for the placement I was in between intermediate and Fallen mode. I think it is now befitting of the game mode between intermediate and Fallen mode. You may argue that these changes are unnecessary because Molten mode was already too difficult for some players. I disagree personally. I thought it's just too easy and too similar to intermediate mode. Especially the boss having 120,000 health compared to I think the 90,000 or so that's the Patient Zero had in Intermediate, or the 100,000. People have also said that this new Molten mode is similar to the original Fallen mode that was seen previously before the Fallen mode rework. I actually kind of agree. Like, these enemies are like a similar difficulty to that, and I think that's what the developers were kind of going for, having the new Fallen mode being harder, and then having something fill in the role of old Fallen mode. I think that's what they're aiming for, except obviously with 35 waves instead of 40, sorry. But that's just my personal opinion. You can disagree or agree. Still though, I would want to see some changes to casual mode to make it more unique and different to intermediate mode.